Despite bringing his party to the best showing in terms of the popular vote since 1988, as well as the fourth best showing for conservatives since the end of World War II, Pierre Poilievre somehow failed to win the election. And to add insult to injury, he actually lost his own seat. This means that our fresh-faced Big Daddy will be spared from Poilievre's greatest strength, his blistering takedowns in the House of Commons.
Why is it that he fired a real Indigenous minister for telling the truth while trying to keep in place a fake Indigenous minister who told falsehoods? This from a Prime Minister who has 20 caucus members that have signed a letter that they're ready to fire him. Why wouldn't they?
I mean, look, false excitement is already getting unhinged without Pierre around. But don't worry guys, Carney has announced that there will be no games, and the moment an incumbent Tory resigns their seat, he will trigger a by-election for Pierre to get another shot to enter the House of Commons. So we may not have to wait for long. But that still begs the question, how did this happen in the first place? Normally, party leaders run in safe riding specifically to avoid this exact humiliation. Papineau was pretty safe for Trudeau. Harper ran in Calgary Southwest, where winning by less than 70% was considered disappointing. But I hear a lot of conservative supporters now getting mad at the higher-ups, wondering why wasn't Pierre protected more? Why wasn't he moved to a safe seat this election?
And that's on his national campaign manager, Jenny Byrne. I know Jenny Byrne is powerful. I know I'm taking a risk saying this, but I don't care because she failed, period. She should have ensured Poilievre's seat was protected or moved him to a safer riding.
Pierre has held on to that riding for 21 years, back when he was just a fresh-faced MP and thus no real need to protect him. So running away from Ottawa now would have sent the wrong signal. It would have meant that the party that told us to not trust the polls back in March and early April, when the deadline to register yourself as a candidate passed, was in fact trusting the polls that showed them to be behind. So I'm sorry, but you can't have it both ways. You cannot tell me the blue wave is coming and the mainstream media is lying, and then also run to a safe seat because you think you're going to lose. You can draw a parallel between Poilievre and Jean Chrétien, who both ran in sometimes iffy ridings due to personal vendettas to prove they weren't scared. Pierre of the Liberals and Chrétien of the Bloc. In both cases, neither wanted to budge because that would have been seen as cowardly. For Chrétien, it turns out it was never needed. Quel chade. The laziest explanation is also the funniest. That being that Pierre Poilievre got absolutely balloted. I mean, look at this monstrosity. Hey Carney, your ballot is 8 inches? Pierre's is 3 feet. There were 91 candidates running in his riding. Pierre, can you please show us on this ballot where they touched you? There are too many places to point to! The protest group called the Longest Ballot Committee, organized to complain about Canada's first-past-the-post voting system, was behind it. They exploited the relatively lax rules of only needing 100 signatures from registered voters in a particular riding to add names until the whole thing became so unwieldy that it catches the attention of the media. All this despite the fact that first-past-the-post is never going to change in Canada since both big parties benefit tremendously from it. Nonetheless, it was kinda funny, but also extremely annoying. I mean, one of the candidates couldn't even be bothered to show up to vote for themselves. I should also point out that the Tories never promised to change the system, whereas the Liberals did. The protest group claims they tried to do the same to Mark Carney's riding, but the fact that he filed to run in a PN 2 weeks before the registration deadline meant they didn't have time to organize. So, was this protest successful in drawing awareness? Yes. Will anything be done about it? No. Was this protest responsible for the downfall of Pierre? I would be shocked. I mean, yes, this ballot is absolutely wild, but was it responsible for tripping up voters? I mean, this list is in alphabetical order, and Pierre Poilievre has been around for 21 years. Plus, he's kinda one of the most famous politicians right now. all you have to do is go down the alphabet until you find P, and there he is. Takes what, like 5 seconds? If they really wanted to mess with Pierre, they would have had to run a candidate with the same name, or at least the same last name. Or maybe someone named Pierre Poilievre or something like that. Then maybe it would have thrown somebody off. But as it stands now, there was only one candidate with the initials PP. Also, I should mention that the Liberals ran a nobody, which I define as someone without a Wikipedia page until the day after the election, and they still managed to win an outright majority of the vote, beating Pierre by over 4,000 ballots. So if Liberal voters had no trouble finding the unknown Liberal candidate in a literal tsunami of independence, I don't think Conservative voters get to blame the ballot, even though it was extremely annoying. But that was election night cope. The new cope excuse I see floating around social media, the one being repeated by every single person that is grasping for an excuse but doesn't want to do any actual research, and that cope excuse is that just before the 2021 election, we had a new census, but we didn't update the actual electoral map across Canada until after the 2021 election. This is how we added a seat in Ontario and BC, and then 3 more in Alberta. Quebec, of course, was supposed to lose 1 seat, but pressed their special Quebec status panic button to get Justin to axe the seat change. But anyways, in the aftermath, the city of Ottawa was carved up again, and the lazy pundits noticed something horrible. A sneak attack. A missile concocted deep in the depths of the Canadian deep state, designed to sink the Poilievre ship and the Blue Wave in order to keep the Liberals in power. You see here? This is the map of the 2021 election results in Ottawa, and here are the new boundaries for the city in this year's election. Notice anything? There is a huge chunk of a Liberal stronghold ripped off and added to Pierre Poilievre's riding. It was sabotage!
Poilievre lost his own riding, Carleton, a seat he has held since 2004. He lost his home, salary, budget, staff, transportation, and his status as leader of the official opposition. Why? Because of a riding redistribution in 2023 that added Canada Carleton, a Liberal stronghold. That should have been anticipated and handled. It wasn't. And that's on his national campaign manager, Jenny Byrne.
Oh my god, we need to sound the alarm. The Tory leadership was asleep at the wheel. The internet found out something 2 years after it was done, while for some reason, the highly paid party bigwigs could not. Time to spread the word without doing even the slightest amount of research. Don't you just love politics on social media? So, that analysis is what you would expect from a channel with less than 1,000 subs, blindly repackaging what they see online in a desperate bid for more views. But here at Your Canadian Guide, we have an entire investigative team, and thus we can offer you analysis at the 10k sub level. You see? Wait for it. This entire area here? While it may be colored in red because the Liberal candidate won the entire riding, that doesn't mean that the Liberal vote was spread out evenly throughout the riding. I know, what an insight, right? Let's take a look. What do we have in the old riding of Canada Carleton? You know, the Liberal stronghold. Well, first of all, calling it a stronghold is incredibly wild. The Liberals won by only 3% of the vote in 2021, which is pretty much how many people voted for the People's Party of Canada back when they peaked at never so slightly relevant status. Looking around for a bit, we find a bunch of suburban voters in Canada, and a bunch of rural voters in these small towns that are still technically within the city of Ottawa limits, such as Fitzroy Harbour, home to the best fudge factory in Canada, which I just realized closed after writing this, and I'm sad. Now, what do we know about small town rural voters in Canada? They vote mostly Conservative. What do we know about suburban voters? Okay, well, that's trickier. If they work for the government or are Franco-Ontarian, they tend to vote Liberal or NDP, unless they're in defense or law enforcement. If they work in the private sector, well, they are a bit more swing voters. So let's take a look at what happened between 2021 and 2025. Looks to me like whoever redrew the lines chopped off all of the small town rural voters that usually vote conservative and stitched them onto Pierre's riding. Meanwhile, the suburban voters that can go either way, you know how liberals are, remain in a new riding called simply Canada. So this change wasn't meant to hurt Pierre, it was supposed to help him. Now, I'm not saying this was done on purpose. The people that redraw the lines follow municipal boundaries and try not to gerrymander, unlike our American friends with their monstrosities. But how can we be sure that this change benefited Pierre? Well, you see, Elections Canada does this thing where they transpose votes from the election prior to a redistribution. They do this because each polling station is mapped to a district within a riding so they can more easily transpose the results. Looking at their website for Pierre's riding of Carleton, my man went from 35,000 votes up to 36,000. Meanwhile, the Liberals went from 24,000 down to 22,000. The NDP was down ever so slightly, hovering at about 8,000. Do you know what this means? This means that if everyone who voted Liberal and Conservative voted the same way as they did 4 years ago, and even if all of the NDP voters switched to the Liberals, Pierre should still have comfortably won by 6,000 votes. Add to the fact that the Tories won almost 8 percentage points more of the popular vote across the country, and this should not have even been a contest. So I don't want to see shit like this anymore on my social media. It's straight up false. The reason Pierre wasn't evacuated to another riding before the writ was dropped was because somebody in the Conservative headquarters went to the Wikipedia page of the riding of Carleton and realized that this new map was beneficial. It also means that all the people freaking out about this liberal stronghold were too lazy to even go on Wikipedia, and that's like the lowest level of effort possible. So for real, why did Pierre lose his seat? Well, the answer is I don't know, but I will offer a slightly more well-researched opinion. Slightly. Looking at the census data, sorted by industry sector, we see that 20% of the riding works in public administration, i.e. civil servants. These lean pretty strongly to the left, at least in Ottawa, unless they are in the Defense Department or the RCMP or any other security agency. But even then, it's still a strong Liberal voter base. We also see that 10% are in the healthcare and social assistance sector. Another place that leans hard to the left, since the right is usually threatening to cut various welfare programs and, even though they don't usually cut healthcare, let's just say the Liberals are less likely to do so. Even though the Liberals did exactly that in the 90s, that has since been forgotten. Plus, Doug Ford screwed nurses a few years ago, so the disdain for the federal Tories still exists in Ontario by proxy. And then there's 7% who work in education services. I don't think it's going to shock you to know that most teachers, pretty much all of them actually, do not vote Conservative. In fact, in my own personal experience in Ottawa, I think the most conservative teacher that I ever had wasn't even conservative. He identified as a, quote, Paul Martin / John Turner liberal, which basically means that you're kind of like a fiscal conservative, but you're more progressive socially. And even that guy would probably end up voting for Carney, since that's kind of the whole thing he was pitching to us. Now, I know this also encompasses like higher education as well, but even there, academia, at least outside of economics, tends to lean to the left. Why that's the case is outside the scope of this video. I'm not getting into it. Plus, for good measure, we have 2% working in arts, entertainment, and recreation. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the hippy-dippy artsy people aren't jumping on the blue wave. So that's 40% of your riding that is very unlikely to support you. That means Pierre had to get 5 out of every 6 remaining votes to squeak out a victory. And to his credit, he came close to winning, with 46% of the vote. And that's assuming these industries didn't grow as a percentage in the last 4 years, which they almost certainly did. but we'll have to wait until the 2026 census is released before we find out if this is actually true. But I am willing to bet $1 to one person that as the civil service grew in the last 4 years, since the last census, many of these new bureaucrats, especially if they are younger, have had to move further away to find affordable-ish housing. They're moving to places like Manotick, Riverside South, Barhaven and Stittsville are bursting at the seams now, and I don't even know what Greeley is, but they're moving there too probably. And all of these are in Pierre's riding. I mean, look on Google. These houses didn't exist 2 years ago. And now people live there, and there's a 2/3 chance that they voted. Okay, obviously this is a massive oversimplification. There are many civil servants who prefer Tories, especially if they work out west. When I interned for the CRA and the GTA, about half of them were conservative because, accountants. But in Ottawa specifically, that number is way less. And this shouldn't surprise you that the party of big government is favored by the government, whereas the party that keeps talking about downsizing the government is not popular with the government. But still, even if this 40% was only 33, that's still not a fun place to be. See, I can rhyme too, Pierre. So you know what? Maybe the haters are right. Maybe Jenny Byrne should have moved Pierre's ass out of Carleton. But that still would have made him look weak, come on. Another way of guessing why this longtime conservative riding flipped to the Liberals is by looking at demographics. Now, demographics are a very hard thing to analyze, so we're going to have to take this with a bit of a grain of salt. But we know that this election was kind of weird in that young people were kind of split between the Liberals, Conservatives, and the NDP, but folks that are in their later 20s and throughout their 30s and even into their 40s actually lean more conservative than liberal, and on the flip side, the baby boomers turned out in droves for the Liberals. A poll published by Ipsos the day before the election showed that among those 55 and over, about half of them will vote Liberal and 34 will vote Conservative, whereas those numbers almost flip, not quite but almost, for the group that's 30 to 54, and among those even younger, it's about an even split. And I know it's just one poll, but other ones showed similar things. So pulling the census data, which again is a little bit out of date now, and weighing it by age group and likelihood of voting Liberal or Conservative, we see that the Liberals come out a bit ahead. And that's largely due to the fact that Pierre's riding has a slightly older population. Of the people that are old enough to vote, the median age is early 50s, which means that about half the voting age population of Carleton is under 50 and the other half is above. And that group that's above split much more in favor of Carney this election than in previous elections. And in case you were curious about what would happen if we reran the numbers with the Nanos poll I just flashed earlier, it doesn't bring the Conservatives over the finish line. I'm sorry. Also, one of the biggest issues of this campaign was housing affordability. Those who are older probably own their own home. And as a result, when the housing market explodes, you feel richer. But those who are younger are kind of sick and tired of having to save for a decade straight just for the benefit of buying something that previous generations could buy for far less. And here I think we find the true kicker. In Pierre's riding, almost everybody owns their house. That one thing that Pierre Poilievre had going for him, specifically the fact that his party wasn't in charge when housing became stupidly unaffordable, it was maybe not quite as important in Carleton. And yeah, I know I said earlier that a lot of younger people are moving out, but those people are moving out to buy houses and work for the civil service. All things that literally point towards the party that plans on keeping the status quo a lot more than the party that plans on shaking things up. So, are any of these reasons the one reason why Pierre lost his riding? Honestly, I don't know. It could be as simple as what Bruce Fanjoy, the Liberal winner, had to say about this. Maybe Pierre just took his riding constituents for granted. It could also be that for millions of Canadians, Pierre Poilievre represented change from the establishment Liberals. But perhaps for tens of thousands of people in Carleton, he was the establishment, not the change. So for now it looks like he is off to Alberta to get his seat, and I guess we'll see him this fall in the House of Commons. I can't wait to see him square off against Carney in question period.